June 5th, 1944, on the radar screens of northern France, a storm of blips appeared, an entire fleet that didn't exist. The night before, D-Day was quiet. Too quiet. The wind whispered across the French coastline, rattling loose metal and the thin wires strung between radar towers. Inside one of those towers, near Calais, a group of German radar operators sat staring at their glowing green screens. The air smelled of cigarette smoke, oil, and tension. "Contact, bearing 270, muttered Corporal Weiss, leaning forward. "Multiple echoes, large formation." His superior, Lieutenant Hahn, frowned. "Show me!" Weiss pointed. The radar screen flickered, its green lines sweeping in circles. Small dots blinked in and out of existence. Then suddenly a cluster of bright shapes appeared, hundreds of them, moving slowly toward the French coast. Hahn leaned closer. That's a fleet, a large one." Weiss swallowed. "Could this be it, sir? The invasion?" Hahn hesitated. "If it is, they're heading straight for Calais." He stepped back, eyes narrowing. "Alert headquarters. Tell them Operation Neptune has begun." And with that, a single message was sent across the German defense network. Enemy fleet approaching Calais. But hundreds of miles away, in a quiet laboratory on the English coast, another kind of storm was unfolding. Inside a dimly lit room filled with hum and chatter, Dr. Reginald Jones, a calm but sharp-eyed British scientist, leaned over a long wooden table covered in maps, radar plots, and thin strips of silver foil. He smiled faintly. "It's working," he said softly. Beside him, Margaret Hughes, a young radar technician, adjusted her headset and listened to the distant reports coming through. "German radar is lighting up like a Christmas tree, sir. Calais is screaming." Jones allowed himself a rare laugh. "Then Operation Window is a success." He picked up a handful of the foil, light, flexible, harmless-looking strips of aluminum. Each one was precisely cut to half the wavelength of German radar frequencies. When dropped from aircraft, the strips reflected radar waves, creating bright echoes, ghost signals that looked exactly like ships or bombers. Margaret looked at the foil in her hand. "It's strange," she said. "Something so simple, and it's changing the course of the war." Jones nodded. "That's the beauty of it, Margaret. The simplest tricks often fool the smartest men." Outside, British bombers were already in the air, flying toward the coast, not to bomb, but to deceive. Each one carried bundles of window, ready to scatter them across the channel. And as the aluminum rained down through the night sky, the illusion began to form. Back at the radar station in Calais, chaos was brewing. "More readings!" shouted Weiss. "They're multiplying!" The screen now glowed with dense patterns of echoes. Entire columns of dots moved steadily toward shore, so many that they began to merge into one continuous mass. Lieutenant Hahn rubbed his eyes. "That can't be right. It's enormous." Weiss nodded nervously. "At least 500 ships, maybe more, possibly the invasion fleet." Another operator shouted, "New contact from our southern station, same pattern. They're confirming visual echoes on their sets too." Hahn's heart raced. "Send word to Calais Garrison Command, prepare for attack." The phone lines crackled, voices shouting over static. Orders flew back and forth across northern France. Coastal batteries turned their guns toward the sea. But out on the horizon, the real sea was empty. Meanwhile, in southern England, another scene played out, one far quieter, but no less tense. At an RAF base near Dover, a group of airmen stood beside a bomber, watching as crates of shiny foil were loaded into the plane's bomb bay. One of the pilots, squadron leader Robert Maynard, wiped his hands on his jacket. "Feels odd, doesn't it?" he said. "Flying into German radar range and not dropping a single bomb." His co-pilot, Sergeant Lyle, grinned. Maybe it's the first time we re-winning a battle without firing a shot. Maynard smiled back. Let's hope Jerry believes our little magic trick. Minutes later, the engines roared to life. The aircraft climbed into the night sky, joining a formation of bombers flying toward the channel. Once over the water, the bombardier opened the bay doors and began releasing bundles of foil into the darkness. The thin strips glittered as they fell, catching the moonlight before vanishing into the clouds. Each one was a lie, and together they became a masterpiece of deception. By dawn, reports flooded into German headquarters. At 4:30 a.m., an officer burst into Field Marshal Rundstedt's command room, breathless. "Herr Feldmarschall, Allied fleet approaching Calais, at least 500 ships confirmed." Rundstedt looked up from his map, tired and skeptical. "Calais," he repeated. "Not Normandy?" "Yes, sir. Radar confirms it. Visuals expected within the hour." Rundstedt sighed. "Then Hitler was right. Calais is the target." He gave the order. "Hold the 15th Army at Calais. We wait for their landing." And with that, the German reserves, their strongest divisions, tanks and artillery, stayed frozen in place, waiting for a fleet that would never come. Back at the British lab, Dr. Jones stood by the radio, listening as intelligence reports arrived from across the channel. Margaret smiled faintly. "German panzer unit still stationed near Calais, sir. Normandy looks quiet." Jones allowed himself a deep breath. "Then they've taken the bait." He turned toward the window. Beyond the English coast, the sea stretched out toward France, calm and pale under the dawn sky. At that very moment, hundreds of real Allied ships were sailing, not toward Calais, but toward Normandy. And because of window, the enemy's eyes were turned the wrong way. Margaret whispered, "Sir, if this works, it could save thousands of lives." Jones nodded slowly. "That's the hope. Sometimes victory doesn't come from strength, but from imagination." He looked back at the thin foil strips scattered across his desk, shining faintly in the morning light. "Funny," he said softly. "The war may be decided by pieces of paper that fall like snow." Back in Calais, as the morning sun rose higher, the radar echoes began to fade. The screens cleared, the blips dissolving one by one. Weiss stared in confusion. "They're disappearing. Sir, the fleet's gone." Lieutenant Hahn frowned. "Gone? That's impossible. Ships don't just vanish." He turned to his men, voice rising. "Where are the visuals? Any planes reporting contact?" "None, sir. The sea's empty." The lieutenant froze. For a long time he said nothing. Then finally he whispered the truth neither of them wanted to say. "We've been fooled." Narrator's closing line. On June 5, 1944, the Germans saw a fleet that didn't exist, and because of that they failed to see the one that did. Operation Window turned the sky into a mirror and the radar into a dream, proving that sometimes the smallest tricks can change the course of the greatest wars. June 7, 1944, as the real Allied invasion stormed the beaches of Normandy, the Germans searched for ghosts in their machines. The roar of war echoed across the French coastline. The beaches of Normandy burned with smoke and thunder, while miles away in quiet bunkers and radar rooms, another kind of battle raged. One fought not with bullets, but with waves and wires. Inside a heavily guarded German facility near Saint-Omer, Dr. Friedrich Keller, a radar engineer in his 40s, sat hunched over a metal desk. The dim light of a single bulb swung above him, casting trembling shadows across the walls. His uniform was rumpled, his eyes red from 2 sleepless nights. He tapped his pen nervously against a notebook. The words written there were a mixture of equations, radio frequencies, and frantic notes from the previous 2 days. Echoes without source, reflections from air, interference patterns. He muttered the phrases like a prayer. Across the room, his assistant, Lieutenant Erich Baum, entered carrying a stack of printed radar logs. More from the Calais sector, sir. Still no consistent readings. They vanish as soon as our patrols arrive. Keller sighed, rubbing his temples. So the enemy fleet simply disappears into the wind? Impossible. Baum hesitated. Maybe it wasn't a fleet, sir. Maybe it was something else. Keller turned sharply. What do you mean? Baum lowered his voice. Some of the technicians believe the British used a kind of radio illusion, false reflections. Maybe metal fragments dropped from planes. For a moment the older man was silent. Then he said quietly, "Metal fragments." His eyes widened. Yes, that would explain it. He stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Erich, prepare the test chamber. We may have just uncovered their trick." Across the channel, in the same hours, the mood at the British Radar Research Lab could not have been more different. Dr. Reginald Jones sat with Margaret Hughes at a long wooden table scattered with teacups, reports, and maps marked with red pins. Margaret smiled, reading the latest intelligence update. "German reserves still fixed at Calais, sir. They haven't shifted their armour toward Normandy." Jones nodded. "That gives our boys the time they need." He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion softening his sharp features. "You know, Margaret, sometimes I wonder if the Germans realize what's happened yet." She looked up. "If they do, it's too late. The beaches are ours now." Jones's smile was brief. "Yes, but the war of minds isn't over. The moment they figure out how we fooled their radar, they'll try to counter it." He paused, then said quietly, "Our advantage never lasts forever." In Saint-Omer, Dr. Keller began his experiment. A small model radar antenna sat on a table before him. Next to it, a young technician carefully dropped thin aluminum strips through a fan that blew them across the room. The radar receiver crackled. On the monitor, a series of bright dots appeared, scattering like fireflies. Keller's face lit up. "There, look at that!" Baum leaned closer. "It's working. Those echoes look exactly like the real thing." "Yes," Keller said softly. "They used this simple material to make us believe an entire fleet existed. Brilliant and infuriating." He looked down at one of the aluminum strips in his hand, its surface reflecting the lamplight. "So fragile," he murmured. "Yet it blinds our machines." Baum frowned. "Should we report it to headquarters?" Keller nodded slowly. "Yes, but they won't like hearing that our greatest eyes have been fooled by tinsel." Meanwhile, in England, the team that had created Window celebrated modestly, but remained cautious. Margaret looked at the sky outside the lab. The clouds glowed orange from the faint reflection of distant fires across the channel. "It's strange," she said. "We win battles we'll never see." Jones smiled faintly. "And save lives we'll never meet." He looked at the strips of foil scattered on the table. "When we first proposed this, the Air Ministry almost banned it. They feared the Germans might copy it." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Would they?" Jones shrugged. "Perhaps. But they're too proud. They won't admit their precious radar can be fooled by something so childish." He paused. "That pride may save us yet." Back in Germany, pride indeed became a barrier. Dr. Keller presented his findings to a small group of Luftwaffe officers 2 days later. Charts lined the wall showing radar plots and interference patterns. He pointed to one graph. "As you see, when thin strips of reflective metal, aluminum or similar material, are dispersed in the air, they produce radar echoes identical to ships or aircraft. If the British used this, it explains the phantom fleets seen near Calais. The room was silent. Finally, General Oberst Kruger spoke. "You're saying, Herr Doctor, that our radar, the most advanced in Europe, was fooled by garbage?" Keller stiffened. "Not garbage, sir. Precision-cut foil. It's clever, but it can be countered." Kruger's eyes narrowed. "How?" Keller hesitated. "By adjusting the radar's frequency, or by filtering out inconsistent echoes, but it will take time." "Time," Kruger muttered. "Something we no longer have." He turned away. "Report your findings, but for now our orders stand. Calais remains the primary defense." Keller exhaled slowly. They still didn't believe it. Night fell again over Europe. On both sides of the war, the battle of light and illusion continued in silence. At the British lab, Jones made his final note of the day. "Deception is the art of making the enemy believe what he wishes to believe. Tonight, they still believe Calais is the target. Tomorrow, we hold Normandy." He closed his notebook and stood by the window, looking out into the darkness. Somewhere across that sea, men were fighting, bleeding, dying and surviving because of an idea born not from firepower, but from thought. At the same hour, Keller sat in his bunk in Saint-Omer, unable to sleep. The sound of distant artillery rumbled faintly in the night. He turned the small strip of foil over in his fingers again and again. "How could something so small blind an empire?" he whispered. He placed it on the table beside him, the lamplight glinting off its edge. In that moment, two men on opposite sides of the same war stared at the same object, one in triumph, the other in disbelief. Narrator's closing line: "In the shadow war of radar and deception, truth and illusion danced together like reflections on the sea. While armies clashed on the beaches, scientists fought their own invisible battles, where victory meant seeing what others could not, and deception was the sharpest weapon of all." June 10th, 1944. The invasion was underway, but the war of radar had just begun. In dark labs and echoing bunkers, two enemies stared at the same screen, searching for truth in a sea of lies. The beaches of Normandy were now under Allied control. From the air, the coast looked like a giant scar across France, blackened landing craft, broken tanks, and tiny figures moving like ants across the sand. But beyond the noise of battle, another front of the war had opened, one without explosions or gunfire, a war of frequencies, reflections, and invisible waves. In a windowless underground lab in England, Dr. Reginald Jones stared at a radar screen flickering green. Each glowing blip represented a plane or ship, or perhaps a reflection of nothing at all. He turned to Margaret Hughes, who was logging readings beside him. "The Germans have begun adjusting their radar. Look at this. Fewer returns, more filters." Margaret frowned. "So they've figured out what we did?" Jones nodded slowly. "Keller, or someone like him, must have reconstructed it, but knowing the trick isn't the same as countering it." He picked up one of the shiny aluminum strips from the table. "Window," as the RAF called it. "We still have a few more ghosts to show them before this war is over." Across the channel, deep in the fortified bunker at Saint-Omer, Dr. Friedrich Keller sat in front of a row of glowing cathode screens. His uniform jacket hung loosely from his shoulders, his face drawn and pale from days without rest. The radar operators around him whispered nervously. "The echoes are smaller tonight, scattered," one reported. But still no visual confirmation. Keller raised a hand. "Record the pattern. Cross-check it against altitude and wind." He leaned forward, watching the glowing lines pulse and fade. Every flicker could be a real bomber or another trick. Lieutenant Baum entered with a file of decoded messages. Headquarters still insists the next Allied attack will strike Calais, he said. Keller didn't look up. They're chasing ghosts. Normandy was the real invasion, and our radar let it happen. Baum hesitated. You can't say that aloud, sir. Keller gave a weary smile. Then I'll whisper it to the machines. They're the only ones who listen. In London, Jones received a new assignment from the Air Ministry, Operation Mandrel, a follow-up deception meant to jam and confuse German radar across the French coast. It wasn't just about hiding Allied planes anymore, it was about blinding the enemy entirely. Standing before a small group of scientists and officers, Jones explained, "We'll use airborne jammers, synchronized with window drops. To the Germans, it will look like hundreds of bomber formations coming from every direction." One officer raised an eyebrow. "And what if they adapt again?" Jones smiled faintly. "Then we invent something new. This is a war of mirrors, gentlemen. Every time they clear the fog, we must make another." That same evening, Keller prepared a countermeasure of his own. He called it Wellenmesser, the wave measurer. It was designed to ignore reflections that didn't move like real aircraft. Baum helped him connect the new circuit to the main radar unit. "If this works," Baum said, "we'll finally see the truth again." Keller's eyes were tired but sharp. "Truth," he repeated softly. "A dangerous word in times like these." The machine hummed to life. The radar display steadied, and for a moment it was clear. No false echoes, only a handful of solid returns. Baum smiled. "It's working." But Keller didn't celebrate. "No," he said quietly. "Not yet. Let's wait until the next attack. That's when we'll know." 2 nights later, the test came. The German radar network lit up with movement, hundreds of blips sweeping toward the coast from the west. Sirens wailed across the bunkers. Operators shouted coordinates. Keller and Baum ran to the observation deck. The night sky was silent, starless, calm. "Where are they?" Baum whispered. Keller stared at the horizon, his mind racing. "They're not there." He turned back to the radar screen, heart sinking. The new filter hadn't saved them. The British had changed tactics again. The false signals now moved like real aircraft, changing speed and direction. "They're mimicking formation flight patterns," Keller said grimly. "Even our corrections can't tell the difference." Baum's face went pale. "So they knew we'd adapt," Keller nodded. "They're always one step ahead." In England, Jones watched as reports came in from field stations. All German radars from Cherbourg to Dunkirk are jammed or misreading. The deception holds. Margaret looked up from her logbook. "And the real bombers?" "Already on their way," Jones replied. "Every false echo we send buys them another mile of safety." He set his pen down, suddenly quiet. "It's strange, isn't it? We create illusions so others can fight real battles. We win by making the enemy see nothing." Margaret smiled faintly. "Sometimes saving lives means hiding the truth." By dawn, the German coast was in chaos. Keller received contradictory orders, some claiming invasion fleets were approaching Brittany, others reporting landings near Calais again. None of it was real. He sat alone at his console, watching as his radar screens filled with static. The hum of the equipment was the only sound in the room. He whispered, "We built these machines to see the world clearly, but the clearer we tried to see, the more the world disappeared." He turned to Baum. "Do you ever wonder if there's a scientist on the other side, staring at his screen like this, wondering if we're real?" Baum gave a nervous laugh. "If there is, I hope he's just as tired as we are." Keller smiled sadly. "He probably is." Across the channel, Jones wrote a note in his journal that evening. "The German radar is blind tonight, But I can't help wondering if one of their scientists is staring at the same silence, knowing he's been fooled. In this war, we don't fight men. We fight reflections of ourselves. He closed the book and turned off the lights. The lab fell into darkness, save for the faint glimmer of aluminum strips hanging from a bulletin board, a reminder that sometimes victory shimmers like tinsel in the air. The invisible war was never fought with bullets or bombs, but with thought, a duel between minds who never met, yet understood each other too well. On both sides of the radar, truth became a shadow, and illusion became the sharpest edge of all. June 14, 1944. The war of machines had turned into a war of minds, but beneath the waves of deception, both sides began to hear something human, the echo of their own conscience. Rain lashed the rooftops of Saint-Omer as thunder rolled over northern France. The war outside was moving fast now. Allied divisions were pushing inland, German forces were retreating, and the once silent sky was alive with aircraft again. Inside the radar bunker, Dr. Friedrich Keller sat before the humming screens, his eyes unfocused. The signals flickered endlessly, but he barely looked at them anymore. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted a mug of cold coffee. "New orders from Berlin," said Lieutenant Baum, entering quietly. "They want constant sweeps on the western coast. Reports say the British are dropping fake readings again." Keller didn't respond. He set his mug down and rubbed his temples. "Fake readings," he murmured. "No, they're not fake. They're designed truths. Every reflection they send has a purpose." Baum frowned. "Truth, sir?" Keller sighed. "Do you know why they call radar radio detection and ranging? Because it gives us the illusion of knowing everything, but every time we think we see the truth, someone on the other side changes the picture." He leaned back, eyes distant. "And we keep fighting shadows." Across the channel, the mood at the British radar lab was both triumphant and uneasy. Dr. Reginald Jones had just finished briefing the Air Ministry on the success of their deception campaigns. Operation Mandrel had blinded the German defences for days, allowing Allied convoys and bombers to move almost unchallenged. When the meeting ended, Jones stayed behind. The room emptied, leaving only him and Margaret Hughes. She approached quietly. "They called it a perfect success." Jones nodded, but his expression was somber. "Yes, perfect." Margaret tilted her head. "You don't sound pleased." He turned toward the window, rain streaking the glass. "Do you know what one of our pilots told me this morning? He said it was eerie flying through enemy territory and seeing no flak, no resistance, just silence. He called it the ghost sky." Margaret folded her arms. "That's what we wanted, isn't it? Less resistance means fewer casualties." "Yes," Jones said softly. "But I can't help thinking. Someone's watching those empty skies from the other side, trying to understand why they can't see us. Maybe a scientist like me, realizing his machines have betrayed him." He paused. "I sometimes wonder what he feels." In France, Keller felt exactly that. The Luftwaffe had lost most of its eyes. Radar stations were reporting contradictory readings. Some even went completely dark. That night, Keller stayed alone in the control room. The power flickered as thunder crashed above. On the screen, faint echoes drifted like ghosts. He adjusted the frequency, tuning it carefully. Then, a voice crackled faintly through the static. At first, he thought it was an operator from another German post, but the accent was wrong. British, it wasn't clear, just a few words fading in and out through interference. "Test frequency, maintain sweep, confirm signal." Keller froze. A live transmission. He leaned closer, heart pounding. "Who is this? Identify yourself." Silence. Then another burst. "Mandrel Unit 3. Checking response window." And then it was gone. Keller sat back slowly. "Mandrel," he whispered. "So that's what they call it." Baum, hearing the noise, rushed in. "Sir, what was that?" Keller pointed at the console. "A ghost, but not the kind you chase away. This one speaks." 2 days later, Keller began his counter-operation in secret. He reconfigured his receiver to lock on to the strange British frequency, trying to learn its rhythm. If he could understand how they jammed his screens, maybe he could reverse the signal. But as he worked, he began noticing something odd. Between the bursts of jamming noise, faint Morse code clicks appeared. Not part of the transmission, more like a signature. He decoded one by hand. It spelled a name, Jones. Keller's pulse quickened. Could it be the enemy scientist? Was he leaving a trace of himself intentionally or by accident inside the very signal that blinded them? Baum looked confused. "You think he's sending us his name?" Keller shook his head. "No, not to us, but maybe to the machines, to mark his creation." He smiled faintly. A ghost leaving his footprint. In England, Jones was performing his own late-night test. He stood in front of the transmitter, monitoring the returning echoes. Margaret noticed a strange pulse pattern on one of the channels. "There's interference on band 3, sir. Repeating clicks. Almost like a code." Jones frowned. "Let me see." He listened carefully through the static. The rhythm was uneven but deliberate. ... Pause. ... "Good Lord," he said softly. "That's Morse. It says Keller." Margaret blinked. "You think it's them?" Jones smiled faintly. "Yes, and I think he's listening to us." He adjusted the dial and transmitted a short pulse of his own. "Hello." Then he sat back, eyes fixed on the receiver. For a long moment there was nothing. Then, faintly, a reply. "Hello." Just one word, bouncing across the frequencies of war. For the next few nights, an unspoken exchange continued. Short bursts of code, never longer than a few words, hidden within the chaos of radar noise. Jones and Keller never spoke of it to anyone. It was a silent acknowledgement between two minds on opposite sides. Enemies by duty, but bound by curiosity and respect. The messages were simple, sometimes just "good night," sometimes test success. Once, Keller sent, "Your window is clever." Jones replied, "Your detection almost caught us." In the middle of war, two scientists shared a fragile truce made of dots and dashes. By the end of June, the Allies had broken through the Normandy defences. The Germans were in full retreat. Saint-Omer's radar station received evacuation orders. Baum looked at Keller as they packed up their equipment. "Should we destroy the records, sir?" Keller nodded. "All of it." But before he left, he took one small strip of aluminum from a captured British plane, a piece of window. He folded it carefully into his pocket. As the last generators shut down, he tapped a final message into the transmitter. "Farewell, may your ghosts rest." And then the station went dark. In England, Jones received that last faint signal. He smiled sadly, recognizing the code. He tapped a single reply. "Farewell, friend." He turned off the transmitter and stood silently for a while. The war still thundered on outside, but in that quiet lab there was peace. The kind that existed only between two men who had seen through the illusions of war. Between two enemies who never met, a silent bridge of understanding formed across the airwaves. In the war of deception, they found truth, not in what their machines showed, but in what they chose to hear. And in the echoes of their inventions, the world caught a glimpse of humanity, flickering softly between the static. May 8, 1945, the war is over. The radios fall silent, but across the quiet frequencies of Europe, One man listens for a sound that may never come again, the echo of a friend he never met. London was alive with celebration. Bells rang across the city. Crowds filled the streets waving flags, hugging strangers, singing songs of victory. The war in Europe had ended. The nightmare that had stretched across 6 years was finally over. But in a quiet office tucked inside a converted radar station on the outskirts of London, Dr. Reginald Jones sat alone. His eyes were fixed on a blank radar screen. The green glow still pulsed softly, though there were no targets left to track, no deceptions left to create. He turned a small knob on the transmitter, an old habit now, and listened to the hum. The static filled the room like the sea. For a moment he thought he heard something buried inside it. A faint click, a whisper of code. But then it was gone. Margaret Hughes entered quietly. "You're still listening?" Jones smiled faintly. "Just one last time." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's over, sir. You won." He shook his head gently. "No one really wins. We only stop fighting." He turned off the radar set and looked out the window. The evening sky was glowing pink and gold. Somewhere across that horizon, in a ruined bunker or a shattered town, he wondered if Dr. Friedrich Keller was still alive. On the other side of that horizon, Europe was a graveyard of cities and machines. The once busy radar bunker near Saint-Omer was silent now, its screens smashed, its walls scorched. Friedrich Keller sat on a wooden crate outside the remains of the station. His uniform was gone, replaced by a worn civilian coat. Around him, displaced families passed on foot, their faces blank with exhaustion. In his hand, Keller held a small strip of aluminum, the same one he had kept from that final day. He turned it over in his fingers, its dull edges glinting in the pale sunlight. A British soldier approached cautiously. "You from the radar unit?" Keller looked up. "Once, not anymore." The soldier nodded. "You'll need to report to the Allied office in town. They're collecting scientists, engineers, people who can help rebuild." Keller smiled faintly. "Rebuild what? The world we destroyed?" The soldier hesitated. "Maybe something better." Keller stood slowly, slipping the aluminum strip into his pocket. "Perhaps," he said, "if we learn to see without the machines." Months later, in a quiet corner of post-war London, Jones received a letter. It came through diplomatic channels. No return address, just a German postmark and the words, "To Dr. R.V. Jones, Air Ministry." Inside was a single sheet of paper written in neat handwriting. "To the man who understood the silence between the signals, you were never my enemy. We both fought blindness that did only from different sides of the light. The world we built with machines was meant to see everything, but it only taught us how invisible we can be. The war has ended, but I still listen to the air sometimes, wondering if your voice still hums there. Farewell once more. Keller." Jones read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it inside his journal. He looked at the old transmitter on his desk, silent now, covered in dust, and smiled. "You made it, Friedrich," he whispered. "You survived." A year later, 1946, the British government declassified parts of its radar deception projects. Journalists wrote stories about the genius of the scientists behind Window, Mandrel, and the ghost fleets that fooled the enemy. Jones was praised as a hero of intelligence, a man who had blinded the enemy without firing a shot. But when asked about his proudest achievement, he didn't speak of inventions or victories. He simply said, "During the war, I once spoke with someone I never met, a man on the other side. For a few nights, we stopped being enemies. That's the only thing I'll remember when all this fades." The reporters didn't understand. They never would. In 1951, Jones visited France for a post-war scientific conference. The countryside had healed, mostly. Grass grew over the craters, new homes rose from ruins. On his way back to Calais, he asked his driver to stop near a small village outside Saint-Omer. He had no clear reason, just a feeling. The remains of the old German radar site were still there. Rusting towers, broken concrete, and the faint outlines of trenches now filled with wildflowers. He walked slowly through the ruins until he saw it, a small wooden cross, almost hidden under ivy, with a tin plate nailed to it. On it, crudely scratched, were the words, Dr. Friedrich Keller, 1902–1945. Jones stood silently for a long time. The wind moved gently through the grass, carrying the faint sound of the sea. He reached into his pocket and took out something he had kept for years. One last strip of aluminum foil, folded neatly. He placed it at the base of the cross. The sunlight caught its surface, flashing briefly like a signal across the sky. "Goodbye, old friend," he said softly. "Your ghosts can rest now." That night, back in London, Jones reopened his radar lab for the last time. The machines were old, but one still worked. He turned on the power, and the room filled with the familiar hum of static. He tuned to the same frequency they had once shared, just to listen. For a long while there was nothing but silence. Then faintly a small echo pulsed on the screen. A blip. Gone in an instant. He smiled. "Perhaps it's only interference," he said. "Or perhaps it's you." He turned off the lights, letting the soft green glow of the radar fill the darkness one last time. Wars end, but echoes remain. In the quiet between battles, men like Jones and Keller found something greater than victory, understanding. Their machines saw only deception, but they themselves glimpsed truth. And long after the signals faded, that truth still shimmered in the air. A whisper between frequencies, a light that no radar could ever see.